All right, everybody. We have Greg Nuckols at the house of Greg Nuckols today. I'm fortunate enough to be a guest here, and he's about to kick my ass in Super Smash. But before we get to that, I wanted to probe his mind a little bit. So you just came out with a new mass series, and I've gotten to two of those articles so far.
Okay.
One was on blood flow restriction in powerlifters, and basically, I mean, we saw huge increases in the slow twitch fibers, right? So could you just kind of detail a little bit about that study?
Yeah, so just as like some basic background information that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. So when this study came out, a lot of people read it and interpreted it as like, oh, powerlifters shouldn't do blood flow restriction training because you're seeing an increase in cross-sectional area of slow twitch fibers, so that may actually decrease performance. The thinking being like it's not going to actually aid strength, but it is going to increase mass, and so that's going to make you relatively less competitive. That is incorrect reasoning because I think a lot of people just don't understand the fiber type differences as well as they probably should. So the difference between type 1 and type 2 fibers, or more specifically like the different myosin heavy chain isoforms, is how quickly they can cycle through ATP and thus contraction speed. And so there's a big difference in normalized power between the fiber types, and there's a big difference in maximum contraction velocity between the two fiber types. But in terms of normalized force output, it's very, very similar. Most studies find no significant difference in normalized force output. Some of them find very slightly higher normalized force output in type 2 fibers, but we're talking like 8 to 10% difference. And also like type 2 fibers also like absolute force output tends to be higher, but type 2 fibers also tend to be larger. So when you normalize it to fiber size, it doesn't really seem to be that much of a difference in force. And so like maybe if you're a sprinter or if you're a thrower or potentially even a weightlifter, increase in type 1 fiber size could potentially be detrimental because that could potentially decrease velocity or power output. But for a sport like powerlifting, where it's just all about force output, it should be beneficial, and I can't particularly see how it would be detrimental. So that's the first thing. Increase in any fiber size for force output should be a good thing. Second thing is the thing that surprised me the most about this study was the preferential fiber type hypertrophy.
Right.
So if you look at the research up to this point on fiber type specific hypertrophy, there were some papers where if you kind of like squinted and tried to analyze like non-significant but like maybe almost significant results, you could kind of maybe see more type 1 fiber growth with low load training and maybe more type 2 fiber growth with high load training. But the only two papers that had really shown that to the degree that it was statistically significant and in line with that hypothesis, like more type 2 fiber growth with high load training, more type 1 with low load training, were a couple papers out of Russia by Nitriva and Vinogradova. And quite frankly, like I just didn't trust those two papers at all.
Yeah.
There were a couple things in them that, quite frankly, just seemed impossible. So for example, like one of them was using isokinetic exercise, and they were having the high load group do, or maybe the medium load group, one of the two. Yeah, it was a high load group, doing knee extensions at 180 degrees per second with a force equal to 90% of MVC, which if you haven't done much isokinetic stuff, that might not mean anything to you. But basically, as speed of contraction increases, the amount of force you can produce decreases. And so at 180 degrees per second, like that's a really fast knee extension. And like you're only capable of producing like 50 to 60% of MVC force at that contraction speed.
Yeah.
So just like the load prescription combined with like the speed of contraction is literally impossible. So yeah, like those two papers are kind of dodgy, and I just didn't really trust them. And the rest of the literature, like I said, was very, very inconclusive. So this was the first paper that from like a reputable research group, or I don't want to impugn that Russian group, from a research group that I personally think is reputable.
Yeah.
That found very clear preferential type 1 fiber growth with low load training. So just as some background on this study, they used trained Norwegian powerlifters, not like super elite people, but average Wilks was between like 350 and 400. So like pretty well trained. And they had one group. So the study lasted 6.5 weeks. The actual different training interventions in the two groups was just week 1 and week 3. Weeks 2, 4, 5, 6, and first half of 7th week, identical training in the two groups. Within weeks 1 and 3, the traditional training group did 5 days of like normal, like heavier front squats. And the blood flow restriction group did 5 days of low load front squats with blood flow restriction. Like 27% of week max, or 24% of 1 rep max in week 1 and 31% in week 3, I believe, but like light stuff.
Yeah.
First and fourth set to failure, second and third set, I think 12 reps on set 2 and 10 reps on set 3, something like that. Okay. And so the training only differed in week 1 and week 3, which also doesn't seem to be that huge of a difference in the programs. But there was no significant hypertrophy in the traditional training group, which is kind of what you'd expect, because these people had been training for several years. Right. It was only a 6.5 week study. In the group doing low load blood flow restriction training, they had significant hypertrophy in all 4 of the heads of the quads. And then when they looked at muscle biopsies, there was a significant increase in type 1 muscle fiber cross-sectional area, about a 12% increase on average, and no change in type 2 muscle fiber cross-sectional area. So yeah, like very clear preferential fiber type specific hypertrophy, and also big group differences in total hypertrophy. Yeah. So that was surprising. One, because increase in quad cross-sectional area was like 8% in 6.5 weeks in the low load blood flow restriction group. That seemed to be driven just by the 2 weeks where training differed, which was huge. And then also like the very, very clear preferential type 1 fiber hypertrophy. So like I'm not entirely sure what to do with that. Yeah. Because like the first thing that came to mind was like, okay, these are powerlifters. Maybe they're just like training heavy all the time. Maybe like
haven't provided that stimulus.
Yeah, maybe they just hadn't been providing much of a stimulus to their type 1 fibers, even though that explanation already presupposes preferential fiber type hypertrophy.
Right.
But so I talked to Lars Samnoy, who was one of the authors of the paper and the I believe the head coach for the junior team for Norway. And he said like these guys were already doing like lighter accessory work. And then also if you look at the cross-sectional area of their type 1 and type 2 fibers pre-training, I forget what unit fiber type cross-sectional area is in. I think it's square nanometers. It's square some small unit of meters. And the numbers you tend to see are like, for untrained people, maybe 4,000 to 5,000, I think, square nanometers for type 1 fibers and 5,000 to 6,000 for type 2 fibers. Pre-training, these guys already, like their type 1 fibers were like 9,000 square nanometers and their type 2 fibers were like 10,000 square nanometers.
Yeah, they're already pre-trained.
Yeah, so their type 1 fibers were already way bigger than you would expect in untrained people. And kind of like the ratio of type 1 to type 2 fiber size is also kind of what you'd see in untrained people. So it seemed like their type 1 fibers had already been trained with like their prior training. So that seems like a non-starter. Another potential explanation is like all of the details for like the traditional training program weren't laid out. But I think it was like 60 to 85% of 1 rep max for sets of 1 to 5 or 2 to 5 for 5 to 8 sets. I believe that's the information provided, which very much doesn't seem like they were training to failure. Versus the low load blood flow restriction group, sets 1 and 4 were taken to failure for those days. So it could just be that you have to train to failure to adequately stimulate your type 1 fibers. So that's a possibility. Although I don't think any other studies have shown that, but the prior high load versus low load studies out there, so one by Mitchell and one by Morton, specifically the Morton study, I would consider to probably be the best in the area up to this point. And it had people training at 50% versus 80% of 1 rep max with all sets taken to failure. So it could be that they didn't see differences in preferential type 1 fiber hypertrophy in that study because in spite of the loading differences, both groups were training to failure. So that could be the variable kind of driving the type 1 specific hypertrophy. But yeah, honestly, it left me with more questions than answers because to this point, I don't think the literature is super clear that training to failure is better than training hard but not quite to failure as far as hypertrophy goes. This was the first paper showing really, really clear preferential type 1 fiber hypertrophy. And it was a relatively small study. So I think in terms of initial recruitment, I think there were 19 subjects total. And in terms of people that had data to analyze pre to post training, I think it was like 8 in one group and 7 in the other. So it could just be a completely anomalous sample. And they had these results just due to sampling variation. I don't really think that's the case because like the whole point of inferential statistics is like it adjusts for small sample size. Like because when you're calculating standard error of the mean, it's divided by square root of sample size. So with smaller samples, you need a larger difference for it to be significant. So it could just be an anomalous sample, but that seems also somewhat unlikely. So really cool paper that I'm still not entirely sure what to do with.
So, I mean, that was obviously in Powerlifters, but do you think, I mean, we've seen other studies on blood flow restriction in general. I haven't seen too much where it's comparing, like here they were actually lifting and then lifting plus the blood flow. I've seen comparisons of just blood flow to just lifting and where they had similar progress. And you can make the argument there if you're injured or something like that, it's helpful. But this is at least the first one I've seen that actually had them doing pretty similar routines and then just that. Do you think for non-powerlifters this is applicable to expect extra progress, or if somebody's been doing more bodybuilding type training for years, they're probably not going to get much from the blood flow restriction? So I think I meant to say this in just like background information, but then just kind of went off on a tangent about fiber types. As far as like the blood flow restriction training research up to this point, there was a meta-analysis that came out, I think just last year, looking at all of the studies that compared hypertrophy using low-load blood flow restriction training to heavier training, looking at measures of whole muscle hypertrophy. And within that meta-analysis, it didn't seem like there were any differences in hypertrophy between blood flow restriction training and traditional heavier training. And again, that's looking at whole muscle hypertrophy, not fiber type specific hypertrophy. But again, most studies aren't using trained powerlifters, and the way they're equating training variables is typically all groups are taking all sets to failure. So that could support the idea that like maybe the difference here was one group was training to failure and the other one wasn't, and maybe the blood flow restriction training didn't actually have much to do with it. So that's a distinct possibility. I need to give a shout out to my friend Nicholas Rolnick. He showed me some papers that didn't measure hypertrophy in type 1 versus type 2 fibers, but just in acute studies looking at markers of muscle damage and cellular stress. There are some papers that have shown that there seems to be more muscle damage and cellular stress within type 1 fibers than type 2 fibers, specifically with blood flow restriction training. So there seems to be like some mechanistic rationale for preferential type 1 fiber hypertrophy specifically with blood flow restriction training, and maybe not necessarily with training to failure. But man, like, and at the end of the day, it is just one study. So you don't want to overreact and completely change how you conceptualize hypertrophy training based on one study. But it was crazy. Yeah, it is. It's super interesting. I've not done blood flow restriction training myself. I don't know if you.
Oh, you should try it. It's sick.
You've done it?
Yeah. So it's great because everyone likes the pump.
Yeah, sure.
Arnold told us about the wonders of the pump back in the day, I wouldn't necessarily say it's quite as good as he described.
Yeah.
But
it's up there.
But it's still enjoyable. And blood flow restriction training, if nothing else, just does give you just an absolutely fantastic pump. So it's fun. One other cool thing about the study. So one of the things I noted when I was describing it initially is the training between the groups did just differ on week 1 and week 3. Mm-hmm. The reason they set it up that way is there was some research showing. There was a paper looking at the time course of hypertrophy with low load blood flow restriction training, finding that it seemed like most of the hypertrophy that was going to occurred within about 10 days or so. Oh. And there's also some research, I believe in rodents, not humans, but there is some research looking at signaling pathways associated with hypertrophy and how long after the cessation of a training stimulus it takes for the sensitivity of those pathways to return back to baseline. Yeah. And that also seems to be around like a week to a week and a half. And so the reason they set up the study the way they did is they're like, oh, so maybe blood flow restriction training causes hypertrophy, but it does it in like short little spurts. So you do it for a week, that is a very specific stressor, causes a very quick initial adaptation, and then maybe doesn't keep causing additional adaptations to that point. Then you need some time to resensitize yourself to it, do it again, get another little spurt of growth. So that was their rationale for just having the training differ in week 1 and week 3 versus like through the entire 6.5 weeks. And I don't know if I've ever seen another study specifically on blood flow restriction, but in general, set up that way.
Yeah.
So who knows? Like that may explain it entirely.
Right.
So it could be if you do blood flow restriction training, like just doing it every other week or like 1 out of every 3 weeks or something. Mm-hmm. That may be the ticket. Yeah. The ticket to Gainesville.
That's what was interesting to me also is that because the last time it was done was in week 3.
Yeah.
I mean, 3 weeks is a little quick to lose it, but I would expect, if you don't have that stimulus anymore, mm-hmm. maybe by week, even if there was at week 4 some type of hypertrophy from it, mm-hmm. the fact that still at the end of the study is when they were measuring that 12% increase mm-hmm. without the stimulus for such a long period of time.
Well, so there was still a stimulus. Like, they trained all 6.5 weeks.
The same stimulus, though, as far as like the blood flow restriction stimulus, which appears to be the stimulus that mm-hmm. caused that 12% increase in slow twitch.
So I think that was a really good call from a study design standpoint, because one of the criticisms you often see of a lot of resistance training studies, but of blood flow restriction training studies specifically,
like intracellular swelling.
Intracellular swelling. Yeah. So there's some research showing that you may still have swelling within the muscle for up to like 3 or 4 days after a single blood flow restriction training workout. So for the whole last 3.5 weeks of this study, like the training programs were the same. So any like residual swelling from blood flow restriction, like that should have been gone 3 weeks ago. Right. Like up to the time that they were measuring.
How does that compare to regular training, the 3 to 4 days with blood flow restriction? I'm sure it depends on reps and volume and all that, but
so if I remember this particular study correctly, it was just comparing low-load blood flow restriction training to low-load training without blood flow restriction. And I think in that particular study, it took like 4 days for swelling to return to baseline in the blood flow restriction group versus either 24 or 48 hours in the low-load group without blood flow restriction. But yeah, just in a general sense, how long it takes for swelling to return to baseline depends on a lot of things. So volume, how much muscle damage occurred, how novel the stimulus was. So it's hard to give. So, for a stimulus that you're very habituated to, low volume, who knows, maybe 6 hours.
Yeah, right.
If you do like the exact same chest workout every Monday in forever, mm-hmm. And you do it at like 3 o'clock, like, I think most people are like, okay, I'm not pumped anymore at 9 p.m.
Yeah. Right.
Versus if it's like super high volume and like a novel stimulus, like you probably have swelling for like several days afterwards. Sure. Some studies show like even up to like 5 or 6 days. But yeah, it's hard to give like a strict average.
Sure.
Yeah.
How many caffeine drinks is that today?
4?
4, man. What would You mentioned the relative risk. What between the fast metabolism, slow metabolisms? What is the relative risk there?
For a fast metabolizer, there is no increase in risk with increase. So you have a decrease in relative risk from 0 drinks per day to 2 to 3 drinks per day.
Okay.
And then 4 plus is the same relative risk as 0.
Okay.
So increased relative risk from 2 to 3, but no different than if you didn't consume it. For people who are slow metabolizers, I want to say it's like a 3 to 4-fold increase in relative risk.
Of cardiovascular events?
Of cardiovascular events if you're at 4 plus.
Okay. Right.
And like something like a 50% increase if you're just at 1.
Okay. Still significant.
Pretty substantial.
Damn. Okay. And one other study that you had gone over was the differences in fatigue resistance between, I was comparing a younger group and like the really elderly, like 35 plus, right? So what did we see there?
So just to start with, one, I don't think people who are 35 years old are elderly. That's just a jab at Eric Helms, who found out he would have been classified as middle-aged if he participated in the study.
Right.
And I think that triggered a small existential crisis. So that's good. That keeps him honest. So yeah, this study compared fatigue resistance during like a pretty challenging squat training workout in young defined as 21 to 25-year-old males, compared to middle-aged strength-trained males. Middle-aged in the study defined as 35 to 54. What?
The age thing is still making me laugh.
So yeah, they had them do 10 sets of 10 squats at 60% 1 rep max with 2 minutes between sets, which probably isn't just going to crush people because it's 60%. 10 reps is going to be pretty easy for the first few sets. But that's reasonably short rest. 10 sets of 10 is probably going to be fairly challenging regardless. So that's going to be pushing them hard by the end of the workout. And they looked at a lot of measures of fatigue. So they looked at how heart rate changed. They looked at how RPE changed. They looked at how velocity and power changed within the actual, like across the 10 sets themselves. They looked at power in the squat at 20% and 80% 1 rep max loads pre to post. They looked at percent voluntary activation, which is a measure of central fatigue. They looked at resting doublet force, which is a measure of peripheral fatigue. They were very thorough with their fatigue assessments. And not to go through like all of the measures one by one, any differences that were significant were quite small, and were generally computed on like absolute changes pre to post. And since the younger people were a little stronger than the middle-aged people, their absolute changes were larger pre to post. And if you would have computed it based on relative changes, I doubt you would have seen any difference. So yeah, overall, like fatigability between young and middle-aged people who were actively training seemed to be quite similar. And so I thought this study was cool for a couple reasons. One, there's like very little research on middle-aged people. Just because of how scientific funding works.
Right.
People with deep pockets really want to know, they want to characterize muscle mass, fatigue, recovery, etc. in older people. So people like 65 plus, because there's a lot of funding in geriatrics, want to find ways to prevent sarcopenia, osteoporosis, maintain quality of life in elderly people. So there's a lot of work on like elderly populations. Very little work on middle-aged populations. A lot of work on young people, a lot of work on old people. People like 35 to 60, not much of anything. So it was a cool study from that perspective, just because that's an incredibly understudied population. And also cool just because like they didn't find differences in fatigability. And talking to people who are, people who are about to enter their 30s are like, oh, I'm getting old. That's stupid. I'm about to turn, what am I about? 28? Yeah, I think 28. Jeez.
Because that dementia kicking
dude,
in.
no, you just, after 21, your birthdays don't matter anymore. So like, I just kind of forget. Yeah, I'm about to turn 28. Like, I'm getting reasonably close to 30. I still feel the same way I did when I was like 14. Like, I don't know. I I think people who are having those thoughts entering their 30s are crazy. But also like 40s and 50s. Like people I know in their late 30s, like, oh man, 40s, like about to fall off a cliff. People in their 40s, like, oh, I'm about to hit my 50s, gonna fall off a cliff.
Yeah.
Like, and it just doesn't seem like that really occurs. At least not nearly to the same degree that people seem to fear will happen. And I think it largely just has to do with like the trajectory of aging that people follow. So if you come across someone who, like, they're in their 50s, they're still really active, like they work out, they maybe like play sports in like a age restricted rec league or something, like physically they're not that much different than they were in their 20s or 30s. Versus someone who, you know, they're in their 50s, they maybe like played sports in high school, but like as soon as they hit the workforce, they stop doing anything active. Like there's some people in their 50s who you could mistake for being in their 70s.
Yeah. Right.
So I think like this just largely shows that like if you focus on staying active and healthy, you shouldn't really expect fatigability to change all that much, at least through middle age. Even in studies with like active people who are like in their 70s, like there's a marked difference between like your 70s and your 20s.
Yeah.
And so I think this idea largely comes from people watching sports. And they see like, oh, this running back who was like a stud when they were 24 is now,
that's what I was going to bring up,
now 32 and completely washed up.
Yeah.
And then, so I would say two things about that. One is when you're competing against people who are like absolutely physically elite, like a 3% difference in something could be the difference between being awesome and being a complete scrub.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like 100-meter dash. If you get 3% slower and you're running in the neighborhood of a 10-second 100, that's 0.3 of a second. And if you're running a 9.8, you're probably like third or fifth best in the world, something like that. If you're running a 10.1, no one gives a shit. Like there are kids in high school faster than you. So like, yeah, there probably is a drop off as aging occurs. But like, you know, if you're a typical gym rat, like a 3% decrease, probably doesn't matter.
Right.
If you're an elite athlete, 3% difference could be the difference between being amazing and just being a complete scrub.
Right.
And then also just the wear and tear on your body. So, like, sports aren't easy on you.
Yeah.
And specifically, like, most of, like, the major sports in the world, like soccer, you're running up and down the pitch, colliding with people all the time. Football, that shouldn't need any explanation. Like, that wrecks people.
Yeah.
People retire in their mid-30s and need to walk with a cane the rest of their life. Basketball, like, you know, you're running, jumping as high as you possibly can, like, lots of ballistic action. Like, that takes a toll on your joints. So just, like, the amount of damage you're doing to your body competing as an athlete is going to be way greater than it would be if you're just, like, a normal gym rat.
Right, sure.
And then also, like, the actual physical characteristics themselves that are going to define success in different domains are going to be different as well. So for most sports, that takes really good vision. So that's super underrated. And especially in a sport that requires a ton of hand-eye coordination like baseball.
Yeah.
If you have 20/20 vision, you have shitty vision as a baseball player.
Yeah.
And you're going to have a hard time hitting. And so, like, vision just decreases with age. And, like, you know, for most people, if you go from, like, 20/20 to 25/20, like, who gives a shit? Like,
right.
And that's definitely not going to matter in the gym, but, like, that matters in a lot of sports. Reaction times decrease with age, and you can't really do much about that. And, you know, if you can react in, like, 1/20th of a second versus 1/10 of a second, that can be a huge difference if you're playing a sport like basketball or football or tennis or anything else. And power decreases, like power and velocity decrease faster than like force output or like any markers of like aerobic fitness.
Yeah.
So in a sport that's heavily dependent on speed and power, like most pro sports that people watch, like power and velocity start dropping regardless of whether you're training, start dropping in your 20s or early 30s. And so, you know, that can cause a decline in performance that you wouldn't necessarily notice if you're doing something that relies on like just force or muscle mass or endurance. So yeah, that's why I think that like looking at the profile of aging in elite athletes is not overly informative for just day-to-day lifters.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool stuff, man.
I think the camera does no favors to anyone.
Yeah.
Like I think the camera adds 10 pounds of fat and removes like 30 pounds of muscle.
Yeah.
So like one experience I've had meeting like big, either like drug-free bodybuilders or powerlifters, or even like drug-using bodybuilders or powerlifters in real life versus like seeing their videos. Mm-hmm. Like everyone is bigger in person than they are online. So dude, like, you know Bryce Lewis.
Yeah.
Like I saw videos of Bryce, and like Bryce looked like a generally strong, muscular guy. Mm-hmm. Met him in person, and just like, holy shit, that dude is huge. Like huge arms, huge chest, massive calves. Like, and like you can see on video he's muscular, but like it doesn't come across. Same thing with Mike Tushir. Mm-hmm. Like like obviously Mike competed at 275 and then 264 when the weight classes changed. Like no one who's 264 is a small dude.
Right.
But like you see him lifting and you're like, oh, that guy looks big. He looks thick.
Yeah.
But like you meet Mike in person and like Mike is enormous.
Oh, really?
Just to like so getting back to Eric, like like I'd seen pictures and videos of Eric. And like, you know, especially when he's like in stage condition, like dude got absolutely shredded. Mm-hmm. Very much earned the pro card. But like, you know, I never thought that he was like particularly large. Mm. But then, same thing. Like I met him in person and was like, oh, this dude's big.
Yeah.
And like I think that doesn't translate. Like I don't know why you can't pick that up on like video. Or first time I met Chad Wesley Smith, like holy shit. Like again, like dude held just the American squat record at 308. This was, I can't remember if this was right before he went super heavy or right after. But I think he was like 330 or something at the time. Yeah. And again, like I saw him on video and it's like, okay, this is obviously a very large human.
Yeah.
And then move out to California, and this was like right after he'd hired me to do his content, like to be the content manager for JTS. And so this was the first time I'm meeting him in person. Walk into like the taco shop, and there he is like sitting at the table, and it's like, Jesus Christ, this is one of the largest humans I've ever met. Like I was expecting a large person, but he was like half an order of magnitude larger than I expected.
Yeah.